I can dress how I want, text who I want, and party when I want, and you don't get a say in any of it." Madison's words hit me like a sledgehammer while I sat on our shared couch in Phoenix, watching her get ready for another mysterious night out. 3 years together, and somehow I'd become the enemy for asking a simple question about her constant texting with Connor from her CrossFit gym. I was an electrical engineer, 28 years old, steady income, reliable as a Swiss watch, and apparently everything that bored her to tears. Madison worked in marketing for a luxury real estate firm, spent most of her days staging million-dollar homes for Instagram photos, and had recently developed what she called her authentic self, which seemed to involve late-night gym sessions, secretive phone calls, and treating our relationship like an inconvenient obstacle to her social life. The dress she was wearing cost more than my monthly car payment, a designer cocktail number we'd bought together for our anniversary celebration just 2 months ago, back when she still pretended to care about marking special occasions with me. Now she was applying that signature crimson lipstick with surgical precision, transforming herself for someone who definitely wasn't me, while delivering what felt like a calculated ultimatum designed to humiliate me into submission. I'd noticed the changes starting about 4 months ago when Connor joined her gym, subtle at first, staying later for extra sessions, checking her phone obsessively during dinner, suddenly developing strong opinions about my weekend plans, interfering with her need for space and independence. The secretive phone calls had escalated to the point where she'd excuse herself from our living room to whisper on the balcony, claiming work emergencies that somehow always happened after business hours and required extensive discussions with people whose names she'd never mentioned before. Our shared calendar used to be sacred territory where we coordinated date nights, weekend hiking trips to South Mountain, and visits to my family in Tucson, but now every slot was mysteriously blocked with vague entries like gym time or work networking that somehow always coincided with Connor's schedule posts on social media. I'd asked her directly about Connor twice, hoping for honesty, for some acknowledgement that our relationship deserved better than whatever game she was playing, but both times she deflected with accusations about my jealousy and controlling tendencies, making me feel like the problem for noticing obvious changes in her behavior. She'd turned my reasonable concerns into character flaws, my desire for transparency into toxic masculinity, my hope for basic respect into evidence that I was suffocating her growth as an independent woman. Tonight felt different though, like she'd been building toward this confrontation for weeks, waiting for the right moment to establish new ground rules that would give her complete freedom while keeping me around as some kind of safety net, someone to pay half the rent while she explored whatever opportunities Connor represented. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, filled with the tension of everything she wasn't saying directly but wanted me to understand perfectly, that I was officially demoted from boyfriend to inconvenient roommate, expected to fund her lifestyle while accepting whatever scraps of attention she felt like offering between her adventures with other men. I watched her grab her designer purse, the one I'd surprised her with for her birthday last year when things were still good between us, and realized she was using every gift I'd given her to enhance her appeal for someone else. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially funding my own replacement, paying for the clothes and accessories she wore to attract Connor while she simultaneously told me I had no right to express concerns about their obvious connection. Her phone buzzed with another text, and the smile that lit up her face was one I hadn't seen directed at me in months, the kind of genuine excitement she used to show when I suggested spontaneous drives to Sedona or surprise reservations at that little Italian place she loved near downtown Phoenix. She was practically glowing with anticipation as she checked her reflection one final time, adjusting the neckline of the dress to show just enough skin to drive Connor wild while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. The woman standing in our bedroom doorway bore little resemblance to the person I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago, the one who used to curl up beside me on Sunday mornings reading engineering journals together, who'd get excited about my project updates and actually listen when I explained the intricacies of renewable energy systems I was designing. This version of Madison was performing for an audience of one, and that audience definitely wasn't the man who'd shared her bed, her dreams, and half his paycheck for the past 3 years. She'd transformed our relationship into a business transaction where I provided financial stability and emotional support while she provided just enough intimacy to keep me invested, but never enough to feel genuinely valued or prioritized in her increasingly complicated social calendar. The silence that followed her ultimatum stretched for exactly 37 seconds while I processed what had just happened, and then I did something that clearly wasn't in Madison's script for this confrontation. I stood up from the couch, walked to our shared bedroom, and calmly began packing my things into the old military duffel bag I'd kept in our closet since moving in together 3 years ago. Madison followed me, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors with increasing urgency as she realized I wasn't planning to argue, beg, or engage in whatever dramatic scene she'd orchestrated to establish her new relationship boundaries. I methodically folded my work clothes, the pressed button-downs and khakis I wore to client meetings, alongside my casual weekend gear and the collection of engineering textbooks I'd accumulated since graduate school at Arizona State. She stood in the doorway watching with growing disbelief as I emptied my side of the dresser, my section of the bathroom medicine cabinet, and the small desk where I kept my professional certifications and the laptop I used for freelance consulting projects that supplemented my income. I left behind the framed photos of us hiking Camelback Mountain, the ones from our trip to San Diego last summer, all the visual evidence of what I'd thought was a partnership but now understood had been an extended audition for the role of financial provider. The vintage Omega watch my grandfather had given me went into the bag along with my birth certificate, passport, and the emergency cash I kept hidden behind my collection of technical manuals, the practical possessions that actually mattered when starting over. Madison's confusion was turning to panic as I systematically dismantled my presents from our shared space, removing the charging station for my devices, my coffee mug with the ASU engineering logo, even the specialized tools I used for electronics projects that had cluttered our kitchen counter for months. I could feel her watching my every movement, probably calculating how many of our shared expenses she'd suddenly be responsible for covering alone, how many luxury dinners and designer purchases she'd have to sacrifice if my steady income disappeared from her monthly budget. The process took me less than 40 minutes to pack 3 years of cohabitation, which said something depressing about how little of myself I'd actually been allowed to integrate into what I'd believed was our home together. I folded my favorite hoodie, the gray one from my undergraduate program that she'd always complained made me look like a perpetual college student, and realized I was looking forward to wearing it again without commentary about my fashion choices or suggestions about upgrading my entire wardrobe to match her aesthetic preferences. Every item that went into the bag represented freedom from judgment, from constant requests for financial contributions to her lifestyle, from the exhausting process of seeking approval for basic decisions about my own life and career. When I finally zipped the duffel bag closed, Madison was still standing there in that designer dress, crimson lips slightly parted as if she couldn't quite believe her ultimatum had backfired so completely. I pulled out my phone and quickly transferred my half of next month's rent to her account, along with my portion of the utilities and the deposit we'd put down on the apartment when we'd signed the lease together, back when I'd believed we were building something permanent. On her silk pillowcase, the expensive one she'd insisted we needed for her hair care routine, I left a brief note written on the back of an old utility bill envelope I'd found in my desk drawer. The message was simple and direct, the kind of communication I'd learned to appreciate in my engineering work where clarity mattered more than diplomacy or emotional manipulation. I wrote that she'd gotten exactly what she'd asked for, that I respected her need for complete independence, and that I hoped Connor would appreciate the authentic version of herself she'd been so eager to share with him instead of me. The apartment keys went on the kitchen counter beside her designer handbag, my final act of courtesy towards someone who'd made it crystal clear that courtesy was a one-way street in our relationship. I drove through the warm Phoenix evening with my entire life condensed into that single duffel bag, past the familiar restaurants where we'd shared countless dinners, past the park where we used to walk on weekends when she still enjoyed my company enough to spend time together without checking her phone every 30 seconds. The budget in Near the Interstate wasn't glamorous, but it was clean, affordable, and most importantly, it was mine alone without any expectations or ultimatums attached. I paid for a week in advance using the emergency cash from my hidden fund, the money Madison had never known about because I'd learned early in our relationship to maintain some financial independence even when sharing expenses. The clerk behind the desk was a middle-aged woman who barely looked up from her crossword puzzle, And her complete lack of interest in my personal drama felt refreshingly honest after months of navigating Madison's emotional minefield. Room 127 smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and featured a single bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot where trucks stopped for the night on their way to California or Texas. I unpacked my duffel bag with the same methodical precision I'd used to pack it, hanging my work clothes in the narrow closet and setting up my laptop on the desk where I could continue freelance projects without interruption or commentary about working too much on weekends. The silence in the room was profound and peaceful, no background noise of reality television shows, no constant buzzing of Madison's phone with notifications from her expanding social network, no pressure to engage in conversations about coworkers I'd never met or social media drama that somehow required lengthy analysis and emotional support. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe deeply without worrying about saying something wrong or failing to show adequate enthusiasm for Madison's latest career complaints or social calendar conflicts. My phone started buzzing around midnight, Madison's name lighting up the screen with the persistence of someone who'd finally realized the gravity of what had just happened. I'd silenced the ringer hours earlier, but I could see the notifications piling up through the dim glow of the display as I lay in the unfamiliar motel bed, feeling more relaxed than I had in months despite the questionable thread count of the sheets. The missed calls came in waves, starting with what I imagined were attempts at damage control, probably followed by anger when I didn't immediately answer, then escalating to panic as the reality of my departure settled into her perfectly curated world. I didn't listen to the voicemails, but I could picture her progression from confident dismissal to genuine concern about how she'd cover rent and utilities without my steady contribution to our shared expenses. By morning, there were 17 missed calls and 12 text messages ranging from casual inquiries about my location to increasingly frantic demands that I return immediately to discuss our relationship like mature adults. Instagram provided a fascinating window into Madison's attempt to control the narrative of our breakup, her stories featuring artfully arranged cocktails at some upscale bar with Connor prominently positioned in the background of every shot. The captions evolved throughout the night from subtle declarations about living authentically and refusing to compromise her truth, to more obvious attempts at making me jealous with posts about meeting real men who understood how to treat a woman properly. Connor appeared in her content with increasing frequency, their body language progressing from friendly workplace colleagues to intimate dinner companions sharing appetizers and finishing each other's expensive wines. I watched this social media performance unfold with the detached interest of an engineer analyzing a system failure, noting how predictably Madison defaulted to public displays of her supposed happiness rather than private reflection about what had gone wrong between us. She'd always used Instagram as a weapon during our minor conflicts, posting photos that emphasized her independence and desirability whenever I questioned her choices or expressed concerns about our relationship dynamics. The difference now was the desperation beneath the glossy surface, the way she overposted and overperformed her newfound freedom with Connor, as if she could manifest genuine happiness through strategic hashtag usage and carefully filtered selfies. I returned to work on Monday morning, explaining my temporary address change to HR with the kind of matter-of-fact professionalism that my colleagues had come to expect from me during project updates and client presentations. Nobody asked intrusive questions about my personal situation, which I appreciated more than the alternative of office gossip and unsolicited relationship advice from people who barely knew Madison beyond the few company parties where she'd appeared as my polished plus one. My productivity actually improved in the sterile environment of the Budget Inn, where I could focus on renewable energy calculations and system efficiency reports without constant interruptions about Madison's work drama or requests to validate her career decisions that never seemed to involve actual career advancement. The engineering problems I solved during those quiet evening hours felt satisfying in a way that relationship management never had, offering clear solutions to defined challenges rather than the endless emotional labor of navigating someone else's manufactured crises and attention-seeking behaviors. Within 2 weeks, Connor had apparently served his purpose as Madison's statement piece, disappearing from her social media as abruptly as he'd appeared, leaving behind only the awkward aftermath of workplace romance gone wrong. The Instagram stories shifted again, this time featuring solo shots of Madison looking contemplative at coffee shops and scenic overlooks around Phoenix, accompanied by cryptic captions about personal growth and learning to value herself properly. Her friends began appearing in the comments with increasing frequency, offering supportive messages that seemed designed more for public consumption than genuine comfort, the kind of performative friendship that Madison had always cultivated through shared complaints about men and mutual validation of questionable life choices. I recognized the pattern from previous relationships she'd described, where initial excitement about new romantic possibilities inevitably gave way to disappointment when reality failed to match her fantasies about being swept off her feet by someone more exciting than her current partner. The difference this time was that I wasn't waiting in the wings to provide emotional support and financial stability while she processed her latest romantic disappointment. Connor had apparently been as superficial as his social media presence suggested, interested in Madison for the same physical attributes that had initially attracted me, but lacking either the patience or resources to sustain her high-maintenance lifestyle demands beyond a few expensive dinners and carefully photographed adventures around the city. The workout selfies from their CrossFit sessions stopped appearing in her feed, replaced by inspirational quotes about self-worth and finding inner strength that read like subtle admissions of romantic failure disguised as empowerment mantras. I found myself checking her social media with the clinical interest of a researcher studying behavioral patterns, noting how consistently Madison's public persona shifted to match whatever narrative would generate the most sympathy and attention from her follower base. Her friends rallied around her with the predictable solidarity of women who'd watched similar dramas unfold in their social circle, offering comments full of fire emojis and declarations that she deserved so much better than men who couldn't appreciate her worth. The irony wasn't lost on me that these same friends had witnessed her treatment of me during our 3-year relationship, her casual dismissal of my interests and contributions, her expectation that I should fund her lifestyle while accepting whatever scraps of attention she felt like offering between her more exciting social obligations. Madison's Instagram stories began featuring subtle hints about financial stress, artfully arranged shots of her apartment that emphasized its emptiness without my belongings, close-ups of bills and paperwork that suggested she was struggling to manage expenses that had previously been shared responsibilities. The designer dresses appeared less frequently, replaced by more affordable outfits that she tried to present as intentional fashion choices rather than economic necessities. Jessica's call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing solar panel efficiency calculations at my desk, her voice tight with the kind of urgency that immediately suggested Madison-related drama. Jessica worked with Madison at the luxury real estate firm, one of those perpetually concerned friends who seemed to derive personal satisfaction from inserting herself into other people's relationship problems under the guise of being helpful and supportive. She'd always struck me as the type who collected other people's secrets like trading cards, storing them up for strategic deployment when maximum impact could be achieved through well-timed revelations and carefully orchestrated interventions. Jessica informed me that Madison was falling apart at work, missing important client meetings, submitting marketing materials with obvious errors that reflected poorly on the entire team's professionalism, and spending most of her office hours scrolling through social media instead of focusing on the luxury property listings that required her attention. The missed deadlines had escalated beyond minor inconveniences to actual financial consequences for the firm, with potential buyers expressing frustration about delayed information and unprofessional communication that threatened Madison's reputation in Phoenix's competitive real estate market. According to Jessica's detailed report, Madison had received 2 formal written warnings from their supervisor about her declining performance. Warnings that could easily lead to termination if her work quality didn't improve dramatically within the next few weeks. The expensive apartment lease that Madison had insisted we maintain despite my suggestions about finding more affordable housing was becoming financially impossible without my income contribution, forcing her to consider roommate situations with people she barely knew or moving to a significantly less prestigious neighborhood that would damage her carefully cultivated professional image. Jessica seemed to expect that these revelations about Madison's professional and financial struggles would prompt me to immediately return to rescue her from the consequences of her own choices, playing the role of reliable ex-boyfriend who couldn't resist helping someone he'd once cared about during their moment of genuine need. The assumption that I'd drop everything to solve Madison's self-created problems revealed how little Jessica actually understood about the dynamics of our relationship, or about my current perspective on enabling someone who'd made it clear that my support was expected rather than appreciated. I listened to Jessica's entire presentation with the polite attention I'd give to any colleague sharing workplace gossip, occasionally offering neutral responses that acknowledged the information without suggesting any emotional investment in Madison's current situation or future prospects. When Jessica finally asked directly whether I planned to reach out to Madison or offer assistance during this difficult transition period, I explained calmly that Madison had specifically requested complete independence to make her own choices without my input or interference. Jessica's tone shifted from concerned friend to frustrated matchmaker when she realized I wasn't going to automatically resume my previous role as Madison's emotional and financial safety net just because circumstances had become challenging for her. The conversation revealed Jessica's fundamental misunderstanding of healthy relationship boundaries, her belief that men should automatically sacrifice their own well-being to rescue women from the predictable consequences of poor decision-making, regardless of how those women had previously treated their partners. I thanked Jessica for the update and mentioned that Madison had several other friends who were probably better positioned to offer the kind of support she needed during this transitional phase of her life. After ending the call, I blocked Jessica's number and updated my contact information with HR to prevent any future attempts at workplace-based intervention campaigns designed to manipulate me back into Madison's orbit through guilt and manufactured urgency. The entire conversation had confirmed my decision to maintain complete separation from Madison's social circle, recognizing that her friends viewed me as a resource to be activated during emergencies rather than a person with legitimate reasons for ending a relationship that had become emotionally and financially draining. My evenings at the Budget Inn had become surprisingly productive, free from the constant interruptions and emotional demands that had characterized my previous living situation with Madison and her endless stream of manufactured crises requiring immediate attention and lengthy discussion. I'd started taking online courses in advanced renewable energy systems, expanding my professional credentials in ways that would have been impossible while managing Madison's emotional needs and social calendar conflicts that somehow always took precedence over my career development goals. Jessica's attempt at intervention had actually strengthened my resolve to maintain the boundaries I'd established after Madison's ultimatum, confirming that her support network was more interested in returning things to their previous configuration than understanding why that configuration had been unsustainable for everyone involved except Madison herself. The assumption that I should automatically resume financial and emotional responsibility for someone who'd explicitly rejected my partnership revealed how thoroughly Madison's friends misunderstood the basic principles of mutual respect and equal contribution that should define healthy adult relationships. The escalation began 6 weeks after my departure when Madison apparently exhausted her network of sympathetic friends and borrowed phone numbers to circumvent the blocks I'd carefully implemented across all my communication channels. The messages started arriving from unknown numbers with area codes from across Arizona, each one representing a different attempt to penetrate the protective boundaries I'd established around my new life at the Budget Inn and my increasingly satisfying professional routine. Her initial approach involved nostalgic manipulation, lengthy texts about our hiking trips to Camelback Mountain and romantic dinners in Scottsdale, carefully crafted reminiscences designed to trigger emotional responses and guilt about abandoning someone who claimed to have genuinely loved me throughout our 3-year relationship. These messages painted our time together as an idyllic partnership temporarily derailed by miscommunication and outside influences, specifically Connor's predatory behavior and her own confusion about what constituted authentic self-expression versus destructive rebellion against societal expectations. Madison's revisionist history conveniently omitted the months of emotional neglect, financial exploitation, and casual disrespect that had preceded her ultimatum, instead focusing on selective memories of better times when she'd still been motivated to maintain the facade of mutual partnership. The romantic nostalgia phase lasted approximately 1 week before transitioning to angry accusations about my supposed failure to fight for our relationship when it faced its first serious challenge from external forces. According to Madison's evolving narrative, my calm departure represented cowardice rather than self-respect, evidence that I'd never truly valued what we'd built together and had been looking for an excuse to abandon her when things became complicated rather than working through difficulties like committed partners should. Her messages became increasingly frantic as she realized that her attempts at emotional manipulation weren't generating the desperate reconciliation attempts she'd apparently expected, her carefully constructed victim persona giving way to genuine panic about the permanence of my absence from her life. The accusations escalated to claims that I'd psychologically damaged her through my unwillingness to engage in the dramatic confrontations she'd orchestrated, that my refusal to participate in her emotional theater represented a form of abandonment that had left her unable to trust future romantic partners. Madison's final message arrived via a social media platform I'd forgotten to block. A voice recording that lasted nearly 10 minutes and revealed the extent to which she'd convinced herself that I bore responsibility for the consequences of her own choices. Her voice was raw with genuine distress as she explained that I was supposed to have been her safety net, the reliable partner who absorbed her worst impulses while preventing her from making destructive decisions that would damage her career and social standing in Phoenix's competitive professional environment. The recording revealed Madison's fundamental misunderstanding of partnership, her belief that my role should have been protecting her from herself rather than expecting her to develop basic self-control and consideration for other people's needs and boundaries. She'd apparently convinced herself that loving someone meant enabling their worst behavior while accepting responsibility for managing the consequences of their choices, a perspective that explained why our relationship had felt so exhausting and one-sided throughout its final months. According to Madison's tearful confession, she'd expected me to recognize her ultimatum as a test of my commitment, a dramatic gesture designed to prompt declarations of devotion and promises to fight harder for our relationship rather than the literal acceptance of her stated desire for complete independence that I'd actually provided. The voice recording revealed the extent to which Madison had been performing our entire relationship rather than genuinely participating in it, treating our partnership as a script where I was supposed to play the role of devoted boyfriend who would endure any amount of disrespect and emotional manipulation rather than establishing healthy boundaries and expecting mutual consideration. Her breakdown in that final message exposed the calculated nature of her behavior during our last months together, the way she'd systematically tested my tolerance for increasingly unreasonable demands while simultaneously building her exit strategy with Connor as backup plan in case I finally reached my breaking point. Madison had apparently believed she could have both complete freedom to pursue other romantic options and guaranteed emotional security from me, a safety net who would remain available regardless of how poorly she treated our relationship or how openly she prioritized other men's attention over my feelings and contributions. The recording ended with her screaming that I'd ruined her ability to trust anyone because I'd proven that even the most reliable people would eventually abandon her when she needed them most, completely ignoring the fact that she'd explicitly told me to stop having input into her choices and decisions. Her accusation that I'd failed to protect her from the consequences of her own actions revealed everything I needed to know about how she viewed relationships, partnerships, and personal responsibility for the choices that define adult life. I saved the voice message for exactly 24 hours before deleting it permanently, giving myself enough time to process the confirmation that leaving had been absolutely the correct decision for both of us. Madison needed to learn that actions had consequences and that emotional manipulation couldn't substitute for genuine respect and consideration, lessons that she'd never master as long as someone was willing to enable her worst impulses while absorbing the damage she inflicted on everyone around her. 3 months after leaving our shared apartment, I was settling into my new routine at the temporary housing near Arizona State University when an unusual thunderstorm rolled across the Phoenix Valley, bringing the kind of dramatic weather that occurs maybe twice per year in the desert and transforms the entire landscape into something almost mystical. The rain was falling in heavy sheets that overwhelmed the storm drains and created temporary rivers in the normally dry washes, the kind of precipitation that locals photograph and share on social media because it's so rare and beautiful in a region where water is typically precious and carefully conserved. I just finished reviewing technical specifications for a solar array project when I heard someone pounding on my door with the desperate urgency of genuine emergency, the kind of frantic knocking that immediately suggests crisis rather than casual visit from neighbors or delivery personnel. Through the peephole, I saw Madison standing in the hallway completely drenched, her hair plastered to her scalp and her clothes soaked through to the point where she was visibly shivering despite the warm desert temperature that usually characterizes Phoenix evenings even during winter months. She'd lost significant weight since our breakup, her designer clothes hanging loose on a frame that had always been petite but now looked genuinely fragile, almost breakable in a way that suggested she'd been surviving on stress and caffeine rather than proper nutrition. The expensive highlights she'd maintained religiously throughout our relationship had grown out to reveal her natural brown color, creating an ombre effect that would have been intentional if anyone else had done it but clearly represented financial necessity rather than fashion choice in Madison's case. She was wearing a cheap jacket from some discount retailer, the kind of synthetic material that provides no protection against actual rain and probably cost less than she used to spend on a single lunch at her favorite overpriced bistro in Scottsdale, where she'd often met clients for business discussions that somehow always required expensive wine and artisanal appetizers. When I opened the door, Madison immediately launched into a desperate monologue about how she'd realized her mistakes, how losing me had taught her everything she needed to know about what actually mattered in relationships and partnerships, how she was ready to commit to therapy and lifestyle changes that would transform her into the person I'd originally fallen in love with 3 years ago. Her voice cracked with genuine emotion as she described the emptiness of the past 3 months, the way every morning had felt like punishment for throwing away the most stable and caring relationship she'd ever experienced for the shallow excitement of attention from someone who'd never actually cared about her beyond physical attraction. She promised to quit the social media obsession that had poisoned our communication, to prioritize our relationship over her career ambitions that had somehow never translated into actual professional advancement, to become the supportive partner I deserved rather than the entitled princess who'd taken my contributions for granted while pursuing validation from other men. The rain continued to pour behind her, creating a dramatic backdrop for what felt like a scene from some romantic movie where the reformed heroine begs for forgiveness from the patient hero who'd been waiting for her to realize her mistakes and return to claim the love she'd carelessly discarded. Madison's desperation was palpable and seemingly genuine, her tears mixing with rainwater as she explained how Connor had used her for easy physical intimacy before discarding her when she'd started expecting the kind of emotional investment and relationship progression that she'd previously taken for granted from me. I listened to her entire presentation with the same calm attention I'd give to any engineering proposal, noting the technical specifications of her promises while evaluating the probability that she could actually deliver on the systemic changes she was describing with such passionate conviction. When Madison finally paused for my response, I explained calmly that our relationship had ended the moment she'd issued her ultimatum about dressing, texting, and partying however she pleased without my input, that her declaration of independence hadn't been a temporary emotional outburst but a fundamental statement about how she viewed partnership and mutual consideration. I told her that the version of myself who'd worried about her choices, who'd waited up when she stayed out late with Connor, who'd absorbed her casual disrespect while hoping she'd eventually appreciate my contributions, no longer existed because she'd successfully eliminated him through her systematic destruction of trust and reciprocal care. Madison's face crumpled as she realized I wasn't going to immediately forgive everything and resume our previous dynamic, that her rain-soaked dramatic gesture wouldn't automatically restore the relationship she'd discarded when it became inconvenient for her social aspirations. She'd apparently expected that her suffering would serve as sufficient payment for her mistakes, that the obvious consequences of her choices would inspire enough sympathy to override my memory of how she'd treated me during our final months together when I'd still been invested in making our partnership work. The thunderstorm continued to rage around us, but I remained dry in my doorway while Madison stood in the hallway getting progressively more soaked, the physical manifestation of the emotional distance that had become permanent rather than temporary separation. I wished her well and genuinely hoped she'd learn from this experience, but I explained that those lessons needed to benefit her future relationships rather than serving as the foundation for reconciliation with someone she'd already proven she couldn't respect or value appropriately when given the opportunity. The conversation ended with Madison standing in the storm, finally understanding that some choices create permanent consequences that can't be undone through regret or dramatic gestures, while I closed my door and returned to the warmth and peace of my temporary apartment where nobody questioned my worth or treated my caring as weakness to be exploited for personal gain. Standing firm in my boundaries felt like the most honest thing I'd done in months, choosing self-respect over the comfortable familiarity of rescuing someone who'd made it clear that my rescue efforts were expected rather than appreciated. Madison had needed to hear that the version of myself who'd absorbed her ultimatums and emotional manipulation no longer existed, that she'd successfully eliminated the accommodating boyfriend who'd enabled her worst impulses by refusing to establish consequences for behavior that damaged our partnership. I'd spent 3 years gradually shrinking myself to fit into the narrow space she'd allocated for my needs and opinions, accepting less consideration and respect each month while telling myself that love required patience and understanding rather than mutual effort and reciprocity.